Welcome to Reform Thinking. I want you to picture a scene with me today.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So it is November 5th, 1854. You are walking into the new Park Street Chapel in London.
Right.
The damp autumn chill is, just hanging in the air. You slide into a wooden pew and the room is packed, like breathless.
It's that classic London autumn weather, right?
Precisely. And usually when you step into a church on a Sunday morning, you anticipate a certain atmosphere.
Yeah. Quiet reverence, maybe a polite greeting.
Right, a soft message that offers a temporary retreat from the harsh noise of the outside world. But this people steps up to the pulpit. A young man named Charles Spurgeon.
And he doesn't give that serene greeting at all.
No, not at all. Instead of comfort, he plunges you straight into a high-stakes world of hidden explosives.
Thwarted treason.
Yes, and terrifying political plots. He points straight down to the floorboards of English history and starts talking about a literal burning snare meant to obliterate the government.
It is such an arresting way to open a Sunday address. I mean, he drops the listener right into the middle of a geopolitical thriller.
He really does.
And the text he is preaching from is Isaiah chapter 54, verse 17.
Oh, a classic text.
Yeah, it states, "No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn."
And it finishes with, "This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord."
Spot on. So Spurgeon titles this message, "The Saints' Heritage and Watchword." And our goal for this deep dive today is to pull this address apart.
We want to look closely at the theological machinery running underneath it all.
Yeah, we are going to look at his massive, overarching view of history, his logic regarding God's total sovereignty, and the specific mechanism of how a person is justified in the eyes of God.
But before we get into the ancient text of Isaiah, we have to deal with the calendar.
The specific date, right?
Right. It is the 5th of November. And for an English audience in 1854, that is not an arbitrary date.
Not at all.
That day carries immense, visceral, cultural weight. Guy Fawkes Day.
Yeah, the bonfires, the fireworks.
Exactly. Spurgeon uses this specific date as a launching pad. He points out that November 5th marks two major Protestant deliverances in English history.
He starts by looking backward to 1588, bringing up the Spanish Armada.
Which was just a massive event.
Oh, absolutely. He describes this terrifying naval fleet sent by King Philip II of Spain. The goal was to conquer England and force it back under papal authority.
But it fails completely.
Right, he describes that armada being scattered and wrecked by the very breath of God in the form of violent storms.
He brings up 1588 to set a precedent, establishing a pattern of divine rescue. But the main event he focuses on is the Gunpowder Plot of 1605.
Because November 5th, 1854 was the 249th anniversary of that specific event.
Wow, 249 years later and it's still fresh.
Yeah. And for those unfamiliar with the history, a group of conspirators packs the caverns underneath the Houses of Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder.
36 barrels?
Yeah. Their goal was to blow the building to the sky, while King James VI and the entire Protestant leadership of England were inside.
They were literally hours away from lighting the fuse when the plot was discovered.
It was that close.
Yeah.
And Spurgeon also folds the year 1688 into this date, referencing the Glorious Revolution.
Right, where King William III crossed the Channel to ascend the throne, stopping King James II from returning the nation to Catholic rule.
Now, reading the transcript of his address, you notice immediately that he does not hold back on the rhetoric.
Oh, he goes all in.
He really does. He uses phrases like knavish tricks and cowardly traitors.
Schemes for crushing our glorious Protestantism.
Right. He is painting the Catholic Church of his era as a looming existential threat. It is very fiery, confrontational language.
It's super confrontational, and when we read historical documents with this kind of intense anti-Rome language, we have to view it through the lens of their lived reality.
Right. We are looking at this text impartially. We are analyzing his arguments without endorsing the political hostilities of the 19th century.
Let's be clear about that. We're just reporting what he said.
Exactly. But we must understand that in Spurgeon's context, these events were viewed as literal life-or-death struggles for religious liberty and national survival.
I mean, the memory of the Marian persecutions, where Protestants were burned at the stake, was still etched into the national consciousness.
To his audience, the Gunpowder Plot was not some minor political disagreement. It was an attempted annihilation.
His language reflects the theological dividing lines of an era where your religious affiliation dictated whether you lived in freedom or faced execution.
That makes the contrast he creates even more striking. I mean, he takes national civic holiday and uses it as the introduction to an intensely personal spiritual message.
You don't usually see that kind of fusion.
No, you don't. But it makes total sense when you consider his theological framework. Spurgeon operates from a classical Reformed perspective.
Right, adhering to the ideas found in documents from the 17th century.
Yeah, and in that framework, God is entirely sovereign over every single atom and every single human decision in history.
History is not a random sequence of chaotic events for him.
No, it is the theater of God's providence.
That view of providence is the engine driving his entire argument. When Spurgeon points to the thwarted Gunpowder Plot, he refuses to attribute the discovery to luck.
Or human vigilance.
Right. He doesn't say, "We are so fortunate that a guard happened to stumble upon the cellar."
He says the creator of the universe looked down from heaven, laid their secrets bare, and actively confounded their treachery.
For Spurgeon, history provides the tangible, irrefutable evidence of the biblical promise he is about to explain from Isaiah.
He sees God actively pulling the strings to preserve his people.
I love how he shifts gears here. He takes this macro-level history of England, the Armadas and the gunpowder, and he connects it seamlessly to the ancient promise.
No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper.
Right. He moves from the physical threat under the floorboards of London to a sweeping theology of protection against the physical hand of man.
This is what he calls the first part of the saint's heritage.
So let's look at that. He builds a comprehensive case regarding physical weapons.
He asserts that Satan consistently attempts to use physical force against the people of God.
And he traces this back to the absolute beginning of human history, doesn't he?
He does. He points out that the very first weapon forged against the righteous was a club in the hands of Cain.
Striking down his brother Abel.
Yeah. And he follows that line of physical violence forward, noting that the enemies of God have always utilized the sword, the spear, and the torture rack.
The text from Isaiah implies this reality. I mean, it doesn't promise that weapons won't be formed.
No, it expects them to be formed.
He illustrates this with specific historical vignettes that feel almost cinematic.
They really do. He transports the listener to the shores of the Red Sea.
Oh, this part is amazing. You can picture the Egyptian monarch Pharaoh shouting commands to the soldiers of Memphis.
Pharaoh sees the water divided, standing like walls of snow-white crystal.
He possesses this supreme, blinding hubris. He madly dashes his chariots and horses onto the dry seabed, fully confident that he is going to slaughter the Israelites.
And Spurgeon describes that absolute confidence right before the walls of water collapse.
Just swallowing the entire army in loud, thundering billows.
It's incredible imagery. And he pairs the Egyptian defeat with another vivid historical record. Haman and Mordecai from the Book of Esther.
Right. He analyzes the psychology of Haman.
Here's a man cunningly laying his plots, using his political influence to obtain the king's consent for a genocide.
And delighting in his own imagination.
Yes, Haman builds a gallows 50 cubits high.
He can already picture Mordecai swinging from the rope.
But the plot reverses completely.
Yep.
Haman is executed on the specific structure he designed for his enemy.
Spurgeon uses these narratives to demonstrate a consistent principle. The enemies of God's people frequently engineer the precise instruments of their own destruction.
Which is such a wild concept when you think about it.
It really is. Reading that made me think about a specific analogy. Spurgeon talks about monarchs forging weapons, tyrants bringing forth chains of iron, and despots trying to crush liberty.
Right.
It is like watching an opposing army construct a massive, intricate siege engine.
Ooh, I like this.
They spend years gathering materials, designing the complex gears, and pulling the tension back on the catapult.
Putting all the resources into it.
Yeah, they possess total certainty that this machine will breach the city walls.
But when they finally strike the lever to fire it...
the entire massive structure shatters into 1,000 pieces and collapses on top of them.
Oh, wow.
It fails because the fundamental physics of the universe were designed by God to reject that machine. The failure was baked into the fabric of reality from the start.
That analogy captures the mechanics of the biblical promise perfectly. The text states, the weapon will not prosper.
Right.
Spurgeon highlights a God who actively interferes with the mechanics of the weapon. He cites Psalm 46, noting that God breaks the bow, cuts the spear in sunder, and burns the chariot in the fire.
The failure of the weapon is not a manufacturing defect.
No, it is a result of active divine sabotage. God disarms the enemy at the very moment they expect victory.
Which brings us to a massive glaring objection. I mean, it is an objection any listener in the pew would immediately raise in their own mind.
The obvious question.
Yeah. If God actively sabotages weapons, if he breaks the bow and burns the chariot, what do we do with the martyrs?
It's a heavy question.
What happens when the weapon clearly, demonstrably strikes its target and kills the believer?
Spurgeon does not shy away from that tension. He leans straight into the paradox of persecution.
He acknowledges the historical reality of those gloomy days.
Right. When the sword did its work with terrible, bloody effect.
Oh, yeah.
He speaks of eras when blood flowed like water down the streets.
When believers were bound to the stake and burned alive.
When pastors were executed and the flock was violently scattered. He gives voice to the agonizing despair of those moments.
Acknowledging that to the human eye, it appeared as though God's ear was deaf to the groans of the suffering.
I appreciate that he doesn't gloss over the horror of it all.
Me too. But how does he reconcile a burning stake with the promise that no weapon will prosper? If you are the one tied to the wood, the weapon appears to be prospering quite effectively.
That's the key tension. He reconciles it by redefining the concept of a weapon prospering against the church as a whole.
Okay, how so?
Well, Spurgeon argues a fascinating sociological and theological point. Persecution never destroys the church. It multiplies it.
I see.
He makes the case that every single time a wave of violent suppression passes over the Christian movement, the movement emerges larger and stronger.
He claims that every drop of shed blood becomes a new believer.
A new advocate prepared to defend the truth. The persecutor intends to extinguish the flame, but their violent action acts like a massive gust of wind on a brush fire.
He uses a nautical metaphor that illustrates the physics of that idea beautifully.
The ship in the storm.
Yes. He says the ship of the church never sails so fast as when she is rocked from side to side by the violent winds of persecution.
You can picture the ship lurching, taking on water.
Right, appearing almost entirely overwhelmed by the storm. But the very gale that threatens to snap the masts and capsize the vessel is the exact aerodynamic force driving it forward across the ocean at maximum speed.
It requires a complete shift in perspective. The enemy looks at the immediate physical casualties and assumes the weapon is functioning perfectly.
But from God's providential, macro-level perspective, the weapon is failing spectacularly.
Because it produces the exact opposite of its intended goal. The objective of the sword was eradication. The result of the sword is unprecedented expansion.
And Spurgeon has this incredible ability to take these grand, sweeping historical concepts and bring them right down into the living room of the listener.
He really does. He shrinks the scale.
Yeah, from ancient martyrs and Roman arenas down to the specific, quiet suffering happening in his own congregation.
He looks out at the pews and speaks directly to sons and daughters enduring cruel fathers.
And women trapped in homes with brutal husbands. He validates the dire, terrifying persecution happening in the very neighborhoods of 19th century London.
He brings the lofty theology into the grit and dirt of everyday domestic reality.
He recognizes that the grand promise of Isaiah applies just as much to a vulnerable individual facing private hostility as it does to a nation facing a naval armada.
I do have to push back on his pastoral application here, though.
Okay, what's the issue?
If you put yourself in the shoes of someone sitting in that chapel, suffering from intense verbal or physical abuse at home, hearing a preacher say, "Persecution shall work for your good," sounds incredibly harsh.
Yeah, it does sound like a terrible platitude.
Right. How is that actually comforting to a victim when they're in the middle of a terrifying situation?
That is a very valid critique of how that phrase sounds to modern ears. We have to dissect his pastoral logic carefully here.
So what is his logic?
Spurgeon is not living in denial of physical trauma. He explicitly admits that a brutal blow will injure the body.
He isn't minimizing it.
No, he is not telling the victim to pretend the pain isn't real or to passively accept the abuse. Rather, he's attempting to equip the sufferer with an eternal perspective that neutralizes the ultimate paralyzing terror of the abuser.
So how does that perspective function in the actual moment of crisis?
It functions by shrinking the perceived power of the monster in the room. Spurgeon does two things simultaneously.
Go.
First, he assures the believer that while their physical body might be harmed, their soul, their core identity, and their eternal future are locked behind a vault the abuser cannot touch.
They are secure.
Right. Second, he issues a severe, terrifying warning to the persecutor. He speaks of chains of hot iron and fiends with whips of fire waiting for those who dare to harm the vulnerable.
Wow.
By contrasting the temporary physical suffering of the victim with the eternal, inescapable doom awaiting the unrepentant abuser, he alters the power dynamic.
He is telling the victim, the person hurting you is not the ultimate authority.
Exactly. They are not a god. They will face a terrifying, flawless justice, and you will be completely vindicated.
When you explain it that way, it shifts from sounding like a cheap platitude to sounding like an anchor.
It removes the lie that the abuser is in total control of the universe.
The abuser is actually on borrowed time, operating under the sovereign eye of a judge who misses absolutely nothing.
And that leads right into the next phase of Spurgeon's argument. We move from the physical threats, the weapons forged by the hand, to the intellectual and verbal threats. We move to the tongue.
The second clause of the text says, "Every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn."
Spurgeon makes a very sharp psychological observation here, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that a person can often recover from a physical wound, bones knit back together, but slander, character assassination, and verbal attacks lay the mental state low.
The tongue is frequently a more devastating weapon than the sword.
Because it targets a person's reputation, their social standing, and their internal psychological stability.
If you think about the modern era, with online mobs and the permanence of digital reputation, his point about the devastation of the tongue feels incredibly relevant. Slander ruins lives.
To address this, Spurgeon takes the listener on a sweeping historical tour of defeated ideas.
He describes looking at human history as if you are walking across a massive, ancient battlefield.
But instead of physical corpses and armor, the ground is littered with dead philosophies and exploded systems of unbelief.
He points to the Greek Stoics and Epicureans who used to lecture in the streets with such absolute certainty, noting that their systems are entirely gone.
He pays special attention to the various forms of skepticism that have arisen over the centuries. He refers to infidelity as a protean creature.
In Greek mythology, Proteus was a sea god who could constantly change his shape to avoid capture.
Right, and Spurgeon argues that unbelief constantly mutates to adapt to the times.
He lists the iterations of intellectual attack from the previous century.
Voltaire, the brilliant French satirist. Tom Paine, the American revolutionary who attacked the Bible.
Robespierre, the architect of the French Revolution's reign of terror. And Robert Owen, the Welsh utopian socialist.
It's like he's pointing to the scoreboard of history.
Every generation produces a new intellectual giant, a new movement that proudly declares they have finally discovered the fatal flaw in Christianity.
They claim they're going to bury the Bible once and for all.
And every generation, that new, supposedly invincible system eventually ends up as just another skeleton on the battlefield with the tombstone reading, "Here lies a fool."
He mentions a specific conversation he had with an older man who was absolutely terrified about the new discoveries in geology.
Oh, I love this story. The old man wrung his hands and said, sir, this geology will quite ruin man's belief in the Bible.
That anecdote reveals so much about the constant anxiety believers often feel when confronted with new scientific or academic paradigms.
His response to the old man is brilliant. Spurgeon claims that every new science, in its raw, imperfect, early condition, is weaponized by skeptics and used as a battering ram against the truth.
But as the science matures and becomes better understood,
It actually transforms into a pillar in Zion's citadel.
he displays absolute supreme confidence in the objective reality of God's truth.
He doesn't think believers need to cower in fear, hide from scientific journals, or bury their heads in the sand.
He expects that a true, accurate understanding of the natural world will inevitably verify the truth of Revelation.
Because the same God authored both.
That intellectual confidence translates directly into his practical pastoral advice for his listeners.
He addresses a very relatable, frustrating scenario.
Imagine you get into a debate with a skeptic, an atheist, or an infidel. You are sitting at a dinner table or working alongside them, and they bring up an argument you have never heard before.
You feel completely outmatched. You freeze up.
The opponent glories in their rhetorical victory, and you walk away feeling crushed.
We have all experienced that exact phenomenon. You leave the conversation, you get in your car, and suddenly you think of the perfect, devastating counterargument 20 minutes too late.
You feel like the tongue rising in judgment against you just won the battle.
Spurgeon insists that the believer should not be discouraged by a temporary rhetorical defeat.
He advises the listener to leave that skeptic alone until the environment changes.
Leave them until they are lying awake in bed in the dark.
Leave them until they are on their sickbed, facing the stark reality of their own mortality.
In those quiet, terrifying, isolated moments, the truth that the believer spoke will rise up and haunt the skeptic.
The truth possesses a resonance that echoes in the human conscience long after the public debate is over.
The condemnation of the opposing tongue frequently does not happen in the public square.
No, it happens in the private, agonizing silence of the adversary's own mind.
Which provides a seamless transition into the most terrifying concept in the entire address.
It is one thing to stand up to a skeptic like Voltaire in the public square, or a coworker in the office.
But Spurgeon argues the far more devastating debate happens when you are entirely alone.
In the courtroom of your own conscience.
This is where he identifies Satan as the ultimate tongue rising in judgment.
This section reveals Spurgeon's deep understanding of the human condition. He knows that external critics are painful, but the internal critic is lethal.
He describes Satan approaching the believer, particularly when they are experiencing a season of failure, suffering, or acute guilt.
Satan whispers, "You are no saint,"
He points out their specific sins, their hypocrisy, and their failures.
claiming they have no genuine union with Christ and no right to the promises of God.
He builds this incredibly vivid legal metaphor to describe the internal psychological state of a guilty conscience.
He describes the mind as a forum, a literal courtroom.
He says the hellhounds of legal convictions are howling at you.
The drum of terrible doom is thundering in your ears.
You are sitting at the defense table in your own head, and the prosecutor has a mountain of ironclad evidence against you.
And the terrifying part is, you know the evidence is true.
You did commit the sin. You did fail. The accusations are factually accurate.
That factual accuracy is what gives the accusation its paralyzing weight. The conscience is functioning according to the law, demanding justice.
But then, Spurgeon introduces the advocate.
He says Christ enters the forum of conscience, the court of King's Bench.
And the mechanism of how the advocate wins the case is vital to understand.
Christ does not stand up and argue that the defendant is innocent of the actions. He does not claim the evidence is fake.
He takes the adversary's brief, the literal list of charges and demands for punishment, and he spoils it using the nails of the cross.
The imagery of spoiling the brief with the nails of the cross is breathtaking.
He is drawing on the theology of Colossians chapter 2, where Paul talks about the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands being nailed to the cross.
He is saying the legal document demanding your condemnation is physically destroyed by the mechanism of Christ's execution.
The debt is paid in full, the charges are legally dismissed by the highest authority in the universe, and the tongue of Satan is permanently hushed.
If we look at this through the lens of Reformed theology, we see why this objective courtroom imagery is so critical for the believer's mental stability.
It shifts the entire basis of salvation away from the believer's subjective feelings.
When you rely on your own feelings, your assurance of salvation fluctuates wildly based on your daily performance.
Or your mood or your anxiety levels.
But this legal framework places the entirety of the defense on an objective, external historical transaction achieved by Christ.
The justification happened outside of you, in a real courtroom on a hill outside Jerusalem, and therefore it cannot be undone by your internal emotional turbulence.
He projects this legal reality all the way forward to the end of time, to the final judgment.
He speculates that the believer will not merely stand before the throne and sigh in relief that they barely scraped by and were acquitted.
He says the believer will actually sit as a co-assessor with Christ to judge angels.
When the old dragon, Satan, the one who constantly accused the brethren, receives his final eternal sentence, the believer will solemnly say, "Amen" to that doom.
The person who spent their life being terrorized by the accuser will actively participate in the final sentencing of the accuser.
It is a cosmic reversal of fortunes.
It is the ultimate eschatological fulfillment of the promise. Every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn.
The vindication is absolute and final.
That raises a massive practical question for the listener sitting in the pew.
If there is an advocate doing all this incredible legal work, spoiling the brief and silencing the hellhounds, how do you know you actually have him?
How do you know you are part of this protected, defended group?
That leads to the second half of the biblical text from Isaiah, the watchword. The text says, "Their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord."
Spurgeon explains the concept of a watchword using military terminology.
In a combat zone, especially at night when visibility is zero, armies use a secret phrase to distinguish friend from foe.
When you hear footsteps approaching in the pitch black, you need to know instantly if the person is an ally or an enemy.
God provides his children with a watchword for navigating the dark world. Their righteousness is of me.
If someone understands and authentically speaks that phrase, you know they belong to the camp of the redeemed.
He outlines a dual meaning for this watchword. First, he notes that God will eventually clear the earthly character and reputation of the saints.
They do not have to spend all their frantic energy vindicating themselves against the slander of the world, because God will handle their justification in the public square eventually.
But the second meaning is the absolute core of the message. God provides the actual saving righteousness required for eternal life.
This is the doctrine of imputed righteousness,
Which is the beating heart of Reformed theology and the foundation of Spurgeon's entire ministry.
To illustrate this doctrine, he uses a creative rhetorical device. Let's call it the single file test.
Let's walk through this line because it perfectly categorizes the psychology of how humans attempt to justify themselves.
Imagine a line of people walking up to a military checkpoint in the dark, and Spurgeon is playing the role of the guard, demanding the watchword.
So the first person steps out of the darkness.
And Spurgeon asks, "What is your righteousness?"
The person replies, "Oh, I'm as good as my neighbors."
Spurgeon immediately rejects them. Pointing to relative morality, claiming you are slightly better than the guy next door, is not the watchword.
Right, he says, "Go along with you. You are not my comrade."
So the second person steps up to the checkpoint. "What is your righteousness?"
This person says, "Well, I am rather better than my neighbors, for I go to chapel regularly."
Rejected again. Religious attendance and proximity to holy things do not generate saving merit. "Off with you, sir. You do not know the watchword."
Then the third person approaches.
"I have been baptized and am a member of the church."
Spurgeon acknowledges that those things might be factually true, but if institutional membership is their actual hope for salvation, they are still lost in the gall of bitterness.
Ritual participation is not the watchword.
Then we get to the fourth person. And this is the interaction that requires the most thought.
The guard asks for the righteousness, and the fourth person says, "Oh, I do all I can," and Christ makes up the rest.
And Spurgeon's reaction is explosive. He calls the answer rubbish. He says, "You are a Babylonian, you are no Israelite, Christ is no make-weight, away with you."
When I read that, I had to stop and figure out why he was so incredibly harsh.
This fourth person isn't rejecting Jesus. They are actively trying to partner with Jesus for salvation.
They are putting in their absolute best human effort and asking the Savior to cover the remaining difference.
I realize why that is so offensive in his theological framework. If you say, "I do my best," and Christ makes up the rest, you are treating the Savior of the universe like a backup generator.
You are treating him like a patch on a leaky tire.
You're claiming partial credit for your own rescue, which insults the total sufficiency of the cross.
Your deduction is spot on. That specific answer represents the most subtle, pervasive, and dangerous corruption of the gospel in a Reformed theological framework.
To understand his severe reaction, we have to grasp the absolute necessity of imputed righteousness.
If you claim that your human effort possesses saving merit, you are saying your righteousness is partially of yourself and partially of God.
In Reformed theology, human righteousness is fundamentally flawed by sin. It is tainted at the source.
It cannot be mixed with the flawless perfection of Christ. Spurgeon uses the term make-weight, which was a small piece of lead used by merchants to balance a scale.
Christ refuses to be a piece of lead added to your good works.
Christ will be the entirety of the salvation, or he will be none of it. To attempt to add human effort to Christ's finished work degrades the glory of the atonement.
It makes complete sense. You are treating the advocate like a paralegal assistant instead of the sole savior.
So finally, the fifth person comes out of the dark.
The guard demands, "What is your righteousness?"
And this person says, "My righteousness is filthy rags, except the righteousness, which Christ wrought out for me on Calvary, which is imputed to me."
And the guard shouts, "Ah, brother, you and I are fellow soldiers. I have found you out." That is the watchword.
The specific theological term used there is imputed.
This means the righteousness is legally credited to the believer's account.
It is not earned through good behavior. It is not generated internally through spiritual disciplines. It is an alien righteousness.
It is completely external to the believer, placed upon them by God as a free gift.
This doctrine is the great unifying factor for all true believers. Spurgeon explicitly states that if a person knows this watchword, he does not care what minor denominational lines divide them.
He says he doesn't ask if they are churchmen, Methodists, Independents, or Baptists.
If they agree on this single, monumental point of relying only on the imputed righteousness of Jesus. They are fellow soldiers in the same army.
It strips away all the tribal markers, all the theological minutiae, and all the cultural differences that people endlessly argue over.
It reduces the criteria for eternal fellowship to one single penetrating question. Where does your righteousness come from?
If your answer is that it comes from God alone, you are in the family.
And that realization brings the entire architecture of his address full circle.
The grand historical events involving Spanish armadas, the theology of protection from physical harm, the terrifying courtroom of the conscience, they all hinge entirely on the reality of this imputed righteousness.
Let's summarize the massive arc we have covered today.
We started with the very real, physical barrels of gunpowder hidden underneath the British Parliament, and we watched Spurgeon connect that thwarted plot all the way back to the waters parting at the Red Sea.
We walked across the battlefield of human history, looking at the defeated, arrogant ideas of everyone, from ancient Greek philosophers to Voltaire.
We moved from the macro level of geopolitics and naval warfare down into the internal, agonizing accusations of Satan echoing in the human conscience.
And we saw how every single one of these threats, whether a literal weapon of iron or a lying tongue of accusation, is resolved by the objective legal transaction of Christ's imputed righteousness.
Spurgeon brings his message to a close with a breathtaking eschatological vision that ties every single thread together.
He pictures a vast host of people clothed in white robes, holding palm branches, standing by a river of harmony in heaven.
These are the individuals who have passed through the great tribulation of human history.
Their robes are radiant white, not because of their own moral achievements, but because they have been washed in the blood of the Lamb.
They are singing the final, eternal chorus of the text we have studied. No weapon prospered. Every opposing tongue is condemned. The heritage of safety is completely secure, and the righteousness is entirely of the Lord.
It is a triumphant, overwhelming conclusion.
And it leaves us with something highly practical to consider for our own lives. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to think about the implications of that courtroom metaphor for your everyday life.
If your righteousness and your defense are completely 100% secured by God in an external courtroom, how should that alter the way you handle your anxieties tomorrow morning?
Think about the mundane criticisms you face at the office, the minor failures you beat yourself up over, the imposter syndrome that haunts you, or the constant exhausting pressure to prove your worth to your peers.
If the ultimate judge of the universe has already reviewed the incontrovertible evidence of your life, allowed the advocate to spoil the brief with the nails of the cross, and permanently close the case in your favor,
Why do you still spend so much emotional energy trying to be your own defense attorney?